Hello, I'm Michael Cantrell, and you are listening to the Prison Officer Podcast, a place to have a conversation about the forgotten cops that work in this country's jails, prisons, and correctional centers. A place for me to try to make sense of a career spent working inside the fence with some of the greatest people that nobody sees or recognizes for the important job they do to keep this world safe. If you love this podcast, hit the follow button, or better yet, share with your family, friends, or coworkers. So this episode, I want to take some time and I want to talk about leadership. Leadership as it relates to corrections. I truly believe that leaders in corrections have different expectations than many other places in the world, whether it be businesses or whether it be law enforcement or the military. I think the leadership that's needed in corrections is different, and we have expectations of our leaders that are different. So today I want to talk about a couple of things, and I'm going to hit these back and forth as I go along. But one of them is the growth of a correctional leader. And I didn't realize this till recently, but most of us start off in our career in corrections to be tactical leaders. That's how we're taught to lead. You know, immediate action, rally the troops, lead from the front, straight to the point, solve the problem. Tactical leadership for most of us is the easier form of leadership because we're used to putting ourselves out there. We're used to taking those risks. And so we first become tactical leaders. But later on in our career, as we grow, as we mature, and as we move into those administrative or executive positions, we have to learn to become strategic leaders. And I want to talk a little bit about the differences between tactical leadership and strategic leadership as it has to do with corrections, or at least as I've seen it in corrections myself. I also want to talk about leading change. That's another one of the hard things as a leader that I dealt with. And change happens all the time. And we have to take our staff, our team, our troops through that change. And then the other thing I want to talk about is leadership through crisis. How we lead during a crisis and the different facets of leadership during crisis. It's not just getting out on the yard in a riot in front of everybody else and lobbing some less lethal downrange. Leadership during crisis takes on multiple facets in a correctional system, and we're going to talk about the different types of crisis that we're going to deal with and some of the tips and tricks, I guess, that I've come across and that I learned that can help you when you're trying to lead during that crisis. So that's the three things I'm going to talk about today. But let's start with, tactical and strategic leaders. I'm going to start with a quote. And for those of you who have read The Art of War by Sun Tzu, that's where this quote came from. And Sun Tzu says, "Strategy without tactics is the slowest route to victory, but tactics without strategy is the noise before defeat." And think about that. Understand what he's trying to say there. If we have this strategy, this vision, this overall thought of how the battle's going to go, but we don't have good tactics to go with it, it's going to take forever to fulfill that vision, to make that vision go forward, to make it work. And just the opposite, if we develop and we have good tactics, but we don't have an overall vision, you're going to eventually wear yourself out. And that's what he says. It's the noise before defeat. Yes, those tactics are going to be brilliant. We're going to do a great job. We're going to stop it. But we have no greater vision to lead us. So we have to have both. I don't want anybody to think that you can have one without the other. Being in positions that required both, I think, have given me a view over the years of how these relate to each other. So let's first talk about tactical leadership. What is that? That's when you become an officer and you first start. Maybe you're assistant team leader. Maybe you're just the number one in a unit, the sergeant in a unit. That's when those tactical leadership skills come about. And a good tactical leader, number one, has skillful tactics. He's studied how things work. He's watched other people work, and his tactics that he deals with those crises, deals with those inmates, are solid. That's what we look for in a tactical leader. He also has a plan of action, and tactical leaders are action oriented. They deal with what's going on now. They deal with resolving that crisis now. It also takes initiative to be a tactical leader. You need to be experienced and you need to be a problem solver. Those are the qualities that people look for in a tactical leader. A strategic leader, though, this is a person who has moved up into maybe an executive position or maybe a team leader. This is a person whose vision, planning, and even their motivation is towards an overall operation. They're directing the overall operation. They're not directing the day-to-day, the minute-to-minute operations. That's for the tactical leader. The strategic leader develops strategies for obtaining a specific goal or a specific result. And most of these strategies are going to be longer term and a higher level view. They're not looking at it from the cell door. They're looking at it from how it affects the entire institution. And sometimes these bump heads, don't they? You've got a strategic leader who's looking at how the whole institution is affected, but you've got, say, a number one or a sergeant in a housing unit who's only seeing how it affects that housing unit. And so they come at odds sometimes. And this is where you have to be careful being a tactical or a strategic leader. You can't pull back into your own world completely. The tactical leader has to be part of the strategic leader's operation. And the strategic leader can't make that vision happen without those tactical leaders. They've got to work together. You know, sometimes when I talk about strategic leadership versus tactical leadership, the comparison I like to make is chess versus checkers. So maybe that can make sense to you also. Checkers is a fast-paced game. You're moving quickly across the board, you're jumping, making kings, and that game moves. But chess is thought out. It's thought out several moves ahead. And that's the way I look at strategic leadership versus tactical leadership. You know, early on, it was super easy for me. From the beginning of my career in corrections, I was taught to be a tactical leader. My supervisors looked to me when it came time to deal with a problem because I was a person who would make decisions, who would move forward. So I was a person who my supervisors looked to as a tactical leader in several areas, not only in running a housing unit, but sometimes as running a team. My supervisors saw in me that ability to act, that initiative. And it's something I've looked at since then. What did they see in me? And the question I got to ask myself was, what did I see in the people who led me? Those leaders who I looked to and who I looked to with confidence. I knew that if that leader showed up and I was following them, that everything was going to be okay. And what was it about those leaders that made me feel that way? Some of the things I've come up with, well, I guess I've actually come up with three. And although I don't think it's unique to corrections, I'm going to tell you three things that I think correctional staff want from a leader, and they want from a tactical leader. Number one, they want a leader that's got a willingness to act, not just someone who can act, but someone who has a willingness to act. There's nothing worse than working that housing unit when you've got a supervisor who has a responsibility to come down there, do the rounds, or deal with what's going on with an inmate. And granted, I'm not the officer who calls the lieutenant's office every time something happens. But there are times when it requires a supervisor to come down to that unit to deal with a problem. And what I look for is a leader who has a willingness to act, whether that action is nothing more than confrontation avoidance at the door, or whether it's running a use of force when that's necessary. I'm looking for a leader who has a willingness to act. Something I see with that is the courage to act. There's a lot of supervisors who I've had over the year, 29 years, who had a willingness to act, but they didn't have the courage to act. They were doing it because they were being pushed forward, not because they had the courage within their self to go down to the unit, to lead that use of force team, to lead that disturbance control team or on the yard. You have to have a leader who you trust has that courage, because the willingness doesn't necessarily mean that they've got the heart when it comes time to stand and fight. And so that's another attribute that I look for in a correctional leader. And the final one is the knowledge to act. I have found over the years that the leaders who I follow the easiest are the ones who are the most read up on policy, are the ones who know not only how to do things, but why we do things. And that's what I look for in a leader. I want someone who has the knowledge to act, someone who's read policy, someone who knows if we're going to use a less lethal delivery system, what's the standoff on that? What's the range on it? I want knowledgeable leaders. Now, I don't expect leaders to be all knowledgeable, but I do want them to be knowledgeable. There's nothing worse than getting halfway into a crisis or a situation or a use of force and find out that we've stepped off in somewhere that that leader doesn't know confidently that we should be, that they've made decisions that have led us into a place that could get people in trouble, that could get staff hurt, get the inmate hurt, because their knowledge wasn't up to par. So, from my experience and what I look for and what I think all correctional staff want from that good leader, that supervisor, that shift supervisor, that tactical leader, is the willingness to act, the courage to act, and the knowledge to act. I would love to hear from you if you have other opinions on that. That's my opinion of what makes great leaders. So let's talk about leadership during crisis. For correctional staff, crisis, it's a daily fact of life for most of us. In a correctional setting, there are two types of crisis mainly. One of them is staff and one of them is inmate. And oftentimes these crises they're intertwined, they're overlapping. Response to an inmate homicide can quickly turn from an inmate crisis to a staff member dealing with PTSD or, suicidal thoughts as a result of the great emotional trauma that they've seen. And the different types of crisis. Sure, we've got, violent crime that goes on. We've got violence that goes on inside our prisons. Just because we lock these inmates up doesn't mean they quit being violent. So you've got violence inside of prison. You've got workplace violence that goes on sometimes. We could be dealing with natural crisis, hurricanes, tornadoes, that type of stuff. We could be dealing with inmate-caused crisis, a riot, a disturbance on the yard. But there's other types of crisis that can affect our institutions just as much. Well, one of them is organizational misdeeds. What happens when we have staff, upper management staff even, who have done things that are now bringing a poor light upon us? How does that make us look as a department, as an agency? What about social media? Things getting out on social media that shouldn't get out. That can cause a type of crisis in our institution. That can cause an emotional toll on our staff, possibly our inmates. What about workplace rumors? What about financial problems? There's a cartoon out there that I like to refer to, and the first frame, you see a man standing on a desert island, a little sandy island with a palm tree in the middle of the ocean. And off in the distance, you can see another man in a little boat. Well, the man on the island is standing there. He's got his arms waved in the air, and he's yelling, "Boat, boat." Then you go to the second frame, and it's from the perspective of the guy in the boat. And he sees the guy in the distance on the small desert island with the little bitty palm tree. And the guy in the boat yelling, "Land, land." And I think it's powerful in the way that it shows things are all about perspective. Both of those guys think they're saved. And both of them think that the other one is in a better position than they are. And it's something that I try to keep in mind is, can I see things from other people's perspective? Because as a supervisor, sometimes what one person's feeling or seeing as a crisis may not be how we perceive a crisis. And we have to take the time to try to look from their perspective. And that goes with inmates as well. A lot of times, those inmates that we deal with, they feel like they're in a crisis situation. And we go down to that unit and we talk to them or whatever, and we don't see the crisis that they're feeling, but we can't see it from their perspective. So that's something that we have to try to do as we move up and as we become supervisors, or I think it's something that supervisors should do. I definitely won't say that there are a lot of supervisors that are good at that, but I've worked with several who are and who can still see things from another person's point of view. And that's huge when it comes to dealing with crisis. So what about leadership during crisis? What's expected of us? What about leadership during crisis? What's expected out of us as a leader? Here's a few things I'm just going to bring to you. It's little tips that I think I learned as I moved through my career. And during crisis, one of the things that we don't realize, we think we're part of the crisis with everybody else, and we are in some ways. But you have to realize that when that crisis is going on is how many people are looking to you. Staff need and they want your leadership at that moment. That's not the time to back off. That's not the time to be part of the crowd. And that goes for if you're a team leader, if you're a housing unit leader, if you're a captain, an AW, a warden. Staff need and want your leadership. They're looking to you for leadership. So that's something that we have to provide as leaders. We have to provide that leadership. We have to provide that direction. Resilient leaders create a resilient workforce. Now, resiliency is a big word these days. There's classes on it and stuff, but what makes a leader resilient? In my mind, two things. One is experience. Nothing beats experience for gaining resilience and becoming resilient. Number two is, at least for myself, is scenarios. I ran scenarios through my mind. What if this happened? What if this could happen? And that built resilience in me because I had thought about many of those situations, many of those crises. I already had a little thing in my mind on what I would do, what direction I would take. And that made me very resilient when it came time. Another thing that leaders do is they continue making decisions. This creates a sense of calm among the employees. But leaders need to continue making decisions. And I guess one of the first things I learned was you can make small decisions first. We all tend to get there and we want to solve the whole crisis. But sometimes we're not able to do that immediately. We don't have the facts, we don't have the resources, we don't have the personnel in place. But you can't let everybody stand around during that crisis. Make some small decisions. Start tasking people with stuff to do. If you can't put the big tasks into effect, then put little tasks into effect. If you know we've got injured people, send people to go get a stretcher and go stage it. If you know that this is going to go on for 2, 3, 6 hours, have somebody go to food service and get water staged so that the people coming in have ways to hydrate. Little things may be the decisions that need to be made at the beginning. And this accomplishes a couple of things. One, it brings a sense of calm to everybody around that leader because that leader's making decisions. And the second thing it does is give those people who are tasked to do something, it gives them a purpose. It gives them something to do at that moment. And the one thing that all staff want when there's a crisis is some way to be a part of it, some way to be part of the fix, of correcting it. So sometimes you just, as a leader, make those small decisions. And what goes right along with making those smaller decisions is for that leader. And it's don't get caught in the weeds. Don't get into the weeds there. Don't get caught up in the minutia details. Task those out. When you have those small tasks come up during a crisis, Give somebody those tasks, get it off your mind. Your job as a leader isn't to get off in the weeds and deal with the small tasks. It isn't to decide how water is going to get from food service to the staff that are coming in to deal with the crisis. Your task is to resolve the crisis. So one of the ways to do that is to make smaller decisions first. Reduce your options. That's something else that I found. And even when we deal with inmates, so let's talk about it this way. When you're dealing with an inmate at a cell door, and you know what I'm talking about, they have worked themselves up and to where you're not dealing with someone who's understanding. They've got 1,000 thoughts blowing through their mind right now. Well, how do you deal with that person? Well, the first thing you do is reduce their options. If an inmate thinks he's got 50 options, he feels like he can do anything. He feels like he can fight you, that there's nothing that you can bring to the door that's going to stop this or resolve this, because he has all these options running in his mind. And we shouldn't give them too many options, but we should give them options. Their option may turn out to be nothing more than come here, cuff up, or we're going to use force. We're going to send, put less lethal in the cell. That may be where we reduce our options to. But when he deals with that inmate, deals with just one or two options, his brain is allowed to slow down a little bit. And the same thing happens to us. If we have too many options, our brain's just going to be buzzing everywhere. It's going to be reaching for all these could be's. And we need to get rid of some of that. When you're dealing with a crisis, when you're trying to decide what the best course of action is, first thing you need to do is reduce your options. Here is 3 things that we could do, which are possible with the equipment we have, with the supplies we have, with the personnel we have. Do your teams and your staff have the skills for that option? But once you get it reduced down to a couple of options, it quits being this burden that's so big over your head as a leader. And it comes down to you making some decisions, which is what leaders do. So finally today, let's talk about leading change. Change is always going to affect us. It affects corrections all the time. There's lots of changes going on right now. And so let's talk about how we lead change inside our institutions. If you haven't read it yet, there's a book out there called It's Your Ship. And it was written by a naval commander named Michael Abrashoff. In my opinion, it's one of the best leadership books for people who work in corrections. And the reason I say that is ships are almost a small city, the same way our penitentiaries or our prisons are. That commander, that warden, is dealing with everything that goes into keeping this city working. So I think if you get the chance to read It's Your Ship, a lot of what he talks about is very relevant for what we do in corrections. But I want to read one quote from his book. And it said, leaders need to understand how profoundly they affect people, how their optimism and pessimism are equally infectious, and how directly they set the tone and the spirit of everyone around them. And that's absolutely true. I found that as an officer, that depending on how I came into work, depending on how I carried myself in that housing unit, determined a lot on how the staff felt, how their day was, depending on how my day was. If I came in a bad mood, usually that would put other people in a bad mood. I found that many of the inmates, and 14 years I worked with a lot of mental health inmates, and they are very in tune to it. If you come into a mental health unit and you're having that bad day and you're kicking that trash can, I guarantee you that by the end of the day, you're going to have a couple of mental health inmates who are doing the same thing. They feed off of that because they're very in tune to the moods and behaviors of the people around them. I found out more so that when I became a lieutenant and later a captain, that I really affected the institution, not just the housing unit. How I came into work and how I carried myself and the mood I was in and how I portrayed that mood at work could affect the institution. So when I talk about leading change, I want us to remember that. Remember how we affect people. A lot of times we don't have the opportunity or the ability to say, we're not going to bring that change in here. Maybe it's policy, maybe it's a change in legislation or laws. PREA was a huge one several years back that came into all of our lives and corrections, that changed the culture of the institutions. And that wasn't something that we could say we're not doing. PREA was a policy that everybody had to adapt to. And that change was tough. The change in culture, the change in rhetoric, how we talked about that type of stuff, all changed. And sometimes as a supervisor, we have to lead that change. Maybe you're a lieutenant, maybe you're a captain, maybe you're a team leader, and the warden has decided that we're going to change something at that institution. He has a vision for how that institution's going to run or how we can improve the operation of it. And they're going to look to you. That executive staff's going to look to that lieutenant, going to look to that captain to lead that change. So leading change, first off, have a bold vision. It shouldn't be something we try to do quietly. Have that bold vision and make sure everybody else knows what your vision is. If that includes having a meeting, if that includes having, a staff gathering and letting everybody see on a PowerPoint or on a board or just listening to you, but you have to let everybody know what that vision is, what direction everyone is going. That's how you get that buy-in. You've got to create a sense of urgency. If you don't have urgency on getting that done, it's never going to get done because no one else is going to feel that urgency. And some of you know what I'm talking about with PREA. Some PREA mandates started 10 years before people adopted them, and they didn't adopt them until there were people knocking on the door saying, you have to have this done in 6 months. And that's when PREA came to some of our institutions. Not only do you have to create a sense of urgency for them, you have to get your staff involved. Get them involved in the implementation and the planning, and do this at all levels, from the lowest level staff member that you have to the highest. They should all be involved in this change. You can say that you want something done differently in a housing unit, but if you don't involve the housing unit officer in making that change, it's not going to happen because he's the person leading that housing unit. The other thing you need to do, in my opinion, is have measured steps. People need goals to reach. So as you're showing them that vision that you want, you have to point them down the path. And down that path should be goalposts. There should be little goalposts along the way. And that allows people to feel like it's moving forward. If the only goalpost on that path is at the very end, you're going to have a lot of staff that get tired before you get there. But if those goalposts are measured and there's goals for them to reach, there's tasks for them to complete before they move on to the next one, they're going to feel enabled by that. They're going to feel involved in what's going on, and how this change is happening is going to come from them. And it's not going to come from you. The vision came from you. And the final thing I guess I'd say is be ready to adapt. Be ready to change course, because just as change comes to us all the time, our plans change. There's an old quote out there that no plan survives contact with the enemy. Well, that's my thoughts on correctional leadership. Specifically the difference between tactical versus strategic leadership and the growth that happens as you move up in your chosen profession. We talked about leadership during crisis and how perspective sets the tone for that. Being able to look through someone else's eyes during a crisis and seeing that crisis, how they see it, can truly affect how you perceive it. And then finally, we talked about leading through change and how we can get our staff involved in leading that change, making them part of it, enabling them. Don't just try to force it down on them. And I just want to leave you with one quote. And I think this is one of the greatest leadership quotes. And it's something I kept in mind the whole time I was coming up through my career. And I have found it works. but you have to have a belief in it. Harry Truman, 33rd President of the United States, was the one that stated, "It is amazing what you can accomplish if you do not care who gets credit." And I think that's very profound. And I think as a leader, if we step back and do things without a care in the world for if anybody ever notices us for it, that you'll be surprised at how much gets done. People want to work for you. People want to be part of this change. They want to follow you during crisis. They want you to lead them. And if you don't care who gets credit for it, if you back off and take that ego out of it and just be the leader for those staff, for those people you work for, I think you'll find how often they will surprise you. That's been my experience anyway. I have worked with some amazing people. I have worked with amazing people who mentored me, who were great leaders to me. And I have worked with great people who supported me as a leader. And every day I was surprised. I don't think I will ever quit being surprised by how much people can do when given the opportunity. And when you get out of their way sometimes as a leader and give them that opportunity, how much they can do. If you enjoy these podcasts, the best way to support the Prisoner Officer Podcast is to share these episodes with your friends or family on social media. Let me invite you to visit www.theprisonofficer.com. If you haven't already, check out the Prison Officer Podcast on Facebook and click that little follow button. Or leave us a message, or better yet, leave us a review. And if you're listening to us on Apple Podcasts, Google, or Spotify, please click the subscribe button. Till next time, I'm Mike Cantrell. Watch your back, and please take care of each other out there behind those walls.